You know what? Uh, maybe I'm wrong on this. Did Gammy say a while ago that she was going to talk to you uh about gender stuff? Do you talk about that a lot?
I think we had a stream with like a few other people. Like we had Calvin Guerra, who's pretty big. And we also had Synth and Gammy. So it was us four. And we did like a big gender stream and talked about a bunch of stuff.
I've been wanting to get Synth on. I don't know. I haven't actually reached out, so I don't want to make it sound like she has refused. But I normally feel like she wouldn't say yes. So I just don't I just don't reach out. But I've tried talking to her a couple of times about it before. So do you who are you closer to? Gammy or Dan yeah, Danny, Synth.
Danny. I I'm not sure. I sort of I love Gammy very much. I think that she's still very adamant about sort of gender positions that I have maybe lost passion for arguing.
Mm-hmm.
A few years ago, I think I was trying to debate Xander Hall before I'd like debated anyone or really had any presence on Twitch.
Mm-hmm.
And I kept asking him, I was like, we like debate me on gender and debate me on transmedicalism and these sorts of things. I don't know why I wanted to debate like Xander Hall in specific. I think I might have just heard like a take of his and was like, this is so bad and like so easy to argue against. Um, but I've sort of lost passion for this. So, like, the claim that trans people need dysphoria to be trans seems like the kind of thing that I think the world would be much better off if we used that definition of transgender. But I also think we don't exist in that world. And I don't think we're like ever going back to it. So I'm not really like hung up on using transgender in this way or like insisting that the definition of transgender is just people with dysphoria.
Yeah.
I'd rather just like, I don't know, bite the bullet and be like, transgender people and people with dysphoria are two distinct but often overlapping groups. And that's like sort of my position. And you know, it'd be fantastic if trans people weren't pawns in a culture war created by a progressive political machine. That'd be great. I don't think that my life is improved at all by this ridiculous degree of visibility that the progressive, you know, political establishment has put on trans people. I don't know if you remember, but like pre 2014, before like Caitlyn Jenner and before gay marriage had been legalized through the Supreme Court, trans people were not like a big topic of conversation or discussion. They were sort of underground. And that was fine. I don't think it needs to be this big political debate or this big social debate. I think it needs to be something that's like between people and their doctors and that political infrastructure that was set up to like push for gay marriage suddenly had nowhere to go, and its eyes turned towards trans people, and trans people have become this like tool for advancing a gender abolitionist position, which has not, you know, not been super good for me. So I'm very much like against the progressive establishment on transgender and like gender abolition or like gender issues in general, but I'm not, I don't know. I don't have the same fire for it as I did maybe a few years ago.
Yeah, I don't know that people believe me, but when I talk about this, like I don't really care about gender, or I don't have like a passion about it, or I don't have like a political thing to push on people. It's just more so that like, did you see the thing recently with the trans couple that went on to Dr.
Dr.
Phil?
Phil
Yeah.
with Matt Walsh. Yes,
Yes.
I did. I'm going to talk with you in a second. Let me just grab some water, like
Yeah, go ahead.
really quickly.
All right. What are
Okay, sorry. Thank you so much. My throat was just terribly scratchy.
no
But yeah,
problem.
Dr. Phil.
I feel like my views are broken again. YouTube every day, like I'll have like 10, 15 people in chat talking, and I can literally see like participants in chat at times will say like 10 to 15 people, but my concurrent viewers will still say like 4 or 5. So I don't know what I don't know if my chat is broken saying how many people are there, or if my viewers thing is broken, but it's always bouncing all over the place. All right. Um, so yeah, so I watched a little bit of it. I didn't watch a whole lot of it, but I saw that like Matt Walsh asked, "What is a woman?" And this seems to be where like a breakdown happens all the time, and it's really frustrating to me because woman is like a it's a concept, like it's something that like it's not definable. It's normally a concept that we have to explain through um, like giving an idea of something that exists or that like a pattern that we can see with our eyes, and we can give different like characteristics or like a prototype or something like that to describe what it is that we understand to be womanhood. And it's really frustrating that like all the time that's where like the conversation breaks down, or like where leftists or gender abolitionists will start to say like, oh, I, you know, woman, oh, that's not, I don't know, that's not even a thing, like who knows, like it's everybody decides for themselves what a woman is, like that's the part that drives me nuts. So like I try to have conversations with people or debates or whatever to like actually get them to understand that there is a concept that exists that is womanhood, that we have, like we all have like a general understanding of what it means to be a woman, and to pretend that we don't is just being dishonest. And I feel like that's how you end up at the gender abolitionist position, is to say, oh, well, we don't even know what a woman is. We don't even know what a man is. So these things don't exist whatsoever. So we should just get rid of them. But I don't think you can get rid of them. I don't think it's that easy. I think that like these things exist pretty objectively, and that like, I think that people just, they feel they oversimplify things to where if you don't have a hard definition for it, then in general it just doesn't exist now. And yeah, that just seems to be our problem over and over. So I try to have a lot of conversations with people. I feel like that's how we end up with like xenogenders as well, is because, oh, well, genders don't exist, so like we can just make genders whatever we want now. It's any identity ever can now be a gender. It's like, no, that's not how these things work. Like we actually can explain what these things are.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you were to ask people, where does your hand end and your wrist begins, you'll get pretty much as many different answers as there are people. Everyone's going to put it in a slightly different place. But like fundamentally, we all agree that like hands exist and wrists exist. And there's like real things in the world that we're representing with this language. And if I remember the Matt Walsh discussion on gender, the gender trans activist person basically says that um, they say like if you ask different people, everyone's going to have a different definition, and so it's up to like everyone to define what woman means to them if they're going to identify as a woman. Which is like, I think it's sort of true in the same sense that like asking people to define what a hand is true. And Matt Walsh has this like opposite position where like he's saying, well, a woman is someone who has this certain set of genitals and chromosomes, and you know typically has the function, the ability to like bear children.
Mm-hmm.
And he's like, this definition is correct, and you don't have this definition, you're basically delusional. And I think that definitions are like, they're one of these like cultural technologies that is like fairly fluid. But there's also like maybe a good reason to defend a definition of woman as something that is like biologically rooted and, not totally like whatever people say. So how should I say this? If we allow anyone to define any word as anything, that word is like effectively useless. So we need to like be able to come together on some shared reality about what words mean and have some consistency with it.
I agree. And I think that that's the problem that Matt Walsh doesn't acknowledge. So I think that we have to recognize two things, especially with a word like woman. Okay. So, like, for example, with woman, we need to know, is there utility in having this current understanding? Like, if his understanding is better, what is the utility in that understanding versus this understanding? And then two, like generally, is that how we use the word? Like colloquially, is that how people use the word? Not is that how they define the word, because normally like in pragmatics we're going to look at how it is people use it. We don't care what definition they give with it. So I think for the most part people would say, oh well, I define a woman as someone with a vagina or with these chromosomes or something like that. But when it someone who looks like a woman comes walking past, they're not checking inside their pants to find out if they're a woman. They're actually looking at a bunch of other things. They never look at whether or not they have a vagina. That doesn't, it's actually irrelevant to them as to whether or not this person's a woman.
Kind of, but like really what people are doing is they're looking at these like secondary sex characteristics and using it as like a heuristic to determine if they have a vagina. So like the thing that Matt Walsh would say is that he's like, yes, I'm not checking in people's pants, but like I know that if I see someone who looks a certain way, there's probably a 99% or greater 99.99% chance that they have a vagina, because the chance that they have a penis and look like this woman that I'm seeing is like, so extremely low. And so that's what Matt Walsh would say. And he's saying that like this perception is like not always correct. He would make this argument, but I am using it as like a heuristic to determine what's in their pants.
Yeah, and he would be right, but that means that we don't actually use the word based on what's in their pants now. It means we use the word based on what you're calling secondary sex characteristics. So just like with race, right? We could talk about the fact that like race is kind of socially constructed, even though there are genes that make you look and grow a certain way and like have all sorts of effects on your biology. We're not checking those genes to find out whether or not you're black. We're looking at you and looking at like, your nose shape, your hair, your skin, like all sorts of other things. And so that's really what decides race. It's not the at least like culturally or like socially, that's how we understand these things. It's not going to be the biological. So we can separate these things and say like, okay, like there's a race in terms of like biology, but then there's also race in the way that we use it in our everyday life. And it's going to be the same with gender. But gender is really only like a social thing now. We have sex for biology. That's like kind of where we draw the line, is we say, okay, like these things are going to fall into sex. But when it comes to the way that we understand these things socially or how we interact with them in our everyday life, we're going to be looking at secondary sex characteristics, or more so a concept of what it is that we expect a woman to look like. And you're going to lose utility of this word if you're saying it is this thing that we don't actually look for. It's about the vagina, but I don't ever know if they have a vagina. I never look, I never check, and I might be right most of the time. I might be wrong most of the time. I have absolutely no clue because I never go check and find out. Like that just seems to lose all value in that case, because that's not how we're actually using the word in reality.
I sort of disagree. I think that have you ever seen those videos online where people make cakes that look incredibly realistic, like other things, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they'll make, for example, like a camera out of cake, and it looks like a camera, but I wouldn't say that just looking like a camera makes it actually a camera. And like when I look at objects, one second.
Mm-hmm.
I am guessing what they are based on appearance. I'm guessing like something about their internal function and how they operate. And so if I see something that looks like a camera and I say that's a camera, but it is in fact cake and is not able to produce pictures or operate like a camera whatsoever, I have this perception, but I think the perception is just inaccurate in this case. And so I think that like the argument that Matt Walsh and other conservatives are going to make is they're going to say, yeah, you can think that someone's a woman. You can look at them and think they operate in a certain way and have these internal parts and are able to do these like certain functions. But, this is not actually the reality. Your perception is just like misaligned based on appearance. And I think that is maybe where they would go with that.
I
Where
so
they'd say there's a distinction between appearance and what is like actually real. So like again, like if you look out into a field and you see something that like is a tree or you think is a tree, but it's actually like a cardboard cutout. That doesn't mean that like trees can be cardboard cutouts. No, the cardboard cutout is not actually a tree. It's a cardboard cutout. Your perception is just incorrect. And it doesn't like invalidate the concept of a tree as like a distinct biological organism with strict definitions.
I so I think that that's a good point. Normally the way that we uh so we'll define different things different ways though. So like when we talk about what it means to be a woman, we're not just talking, like we've never just been talking about like biology. Like when we talk about womanhood, there's always this entire concept that comes with that. What makes you a real woman? Or like you have a period and now you are finally becoming a woman. You're like this is all the same, or same with manhood. Like what it takes to be a real man, right? Like these things have always come with broader concepts. It's never just like the way that it's never just the utility of that person. It's also like with the camera, like the way that I utilize this object is how I'm going to decide whether or not I call it a camera. But with a person, it's not based on how I utilize that gender, unless I'm talking about having sex with them. We can keep biology and have sex terms for that and just say male and female for that sort of thing when it comes to how we interact with it, but or how we utilize it. But when it comes to just interacting on a daily basis, somebody walking across the street in a dress, high heels, carrying a purse, long hair, makeup, all of that stuff, they fit the description of a woman. They fit the prototype of a woman. They fit the concept of a woman. They have everything that we would understand to be womanhood, except maybe they don't have the chromosomes that we would normally think of, which is why like there is utility in separating these two different things to say like one is biological, the other one is going to be based on the entire concept, on how we understand these things and how we interact with them on a daily basis, because they've never just meant, vagina or penis.
Yeah, and I think what you're getting at is a sort of cultural conception of womanhood, and
Mm-hmm.
it's definitely the strongest argument for saying that like trans women are women. And it's just to say that like what is a man or woman is based on a definition, which is cultural technology, and what counts as a woman is ultimately going to depend on the culture. And if the culture is saying that like a woman is either someone who has these sorts of like genitals and chromosomes, and it can sometimes include people who identify with femininity and the concept of woman and, engage in cultural practices associated with womanhood. If that's your like broader expanded definition of woman, and that's how people use it, like effectively for the culture, that's what it means. So
Well, right. That
I
is
think
what I'm
that,
saying, is that regardless of whether or not people want to use that definition, that is what it'll mean to them anyways. Like it's going the like I said, these words will change based on how we use them. And so like if some words are based on like the way that we utilize that thing, then that's like we're going to define them based on how we utilize them. But other things are going to be based on how we interact with them socially or how we understand them socially and broadly.
I think the problem, though, with the cultural argument is that it forces you to bite the bullet that, like, trans women are women in progressive spaces where people use woman to, like, include them. And trans women are not women in spaces that are, like, conservative and don't consider them women,
I don't
right?
think so.
It's
I
just,
think they use it the
you
same way.
don't.
No, I think that the
Mm.
woman has always meant this. I don't think we're actually changing it. I think we're changing the definition. But like I said, the way that we use words is normally how we should come to the definition. And that's the problem, is that people aren't coming to this definition based on how we're using it, because we can show pretty like, definitively this is how we've always used this word. And somehow people are still saying, well, I don't want to use that as the definition, even though I can recognize that that's how I've always used it. I'm not going to let that be the definition. And I think, like, okay, fine, you're still going to use it this way, regardless of whether or not you want to recognize that's the definition you're using. You're still using it the way that we're talking about, one way or the other.
Yeah, I mean, like, conservatives still refer to me as she, her, and I think if they didn't know that I was trans, would typically like refer to me as a woman. So I think this is like kind of true. But I don't think that, like, I guess the disagreement here is I would say that like that doesn't change their definition of woman. They're just like confused about my status in the same way that, like, you know, it doesn't change my definition of camera if I think that a cake is a camera. I'm just like confused about what I'm saying. And that's how I'd say that like conservatives are using the word woman. Oh, yeah, you would have to concede though that like in an environment where people are like very strict, we'll just say like hypothetically, you know, and are checking for like chromosomes or whatever, then like I would not be a woman in that environment.
Yeah. I'm not, like, if we're talking about definitions, you can kind of, depending on the system that you exist in that moment, for the most part, you can mold definitions to be whatever you want them to be. But like the way that we use language is going to be based on an understanding. If I start saying words to you that you don't understand, there's absolutely no use to those words anymore. There's no utility there. All we're doing is saying we're going to give this word the appropriate definition. If you don't want to use that definition, that's fine. You're still using it the way that we define it, regardless. The way that you define it, you're not using it that way. You will never use it that way. You never have used it that way. And you will continue after this conversation and after realizing this, you will still use it the way that I'm saying that you should use it. Or that you're going to use it. And that's like, in pragmatics, that's kind of like the point, is like to come up with how it is that we use the words in general, not assign a definition to a word or meaning to a word, but extract the meaning based on how it's used. And that's kind of what I do. And it's like, it's frustrating because I know that people are stuck to the way that they define it, and they feel like that's the same as the meaning behind the word. And it's like a definition is more so just like words we put on a paper to describe the word the best that we can, but meaning can exist outside of the definition. And especially when we're talking about conceptually with words like this, that'll have a lot more to them. We talk about a Nazi is like defined as like a 1930s German political group, right? But today we don't use Nazi that way. We call all sorts of people Nazis that aren't part of that political group, right? Like we have like different ways of understanding certain words, and it doesn't have to do with the definition all the time. Lots of times it's more so having to do with the meaning behind the word in the way that we use it.
So can I ask a question? Mm-hmm. If let's imagine two opposing groups, and one group says that a camera is something that can take pictures, mm-hmm. and the other group says that a camera is something that looks like it could take pictures. Mm-hmm. And, we look at this cake that looks exactly like a camera, and both groups say, oh, that looks like a camera. Would you say that then the group that is making the argument that a camera is something that can take pictures is effectively not using their own definition because they're labeling something as a camera, even though it is not actually a camera by their definition?
No, because I think it's based on what word gives you more utility, or what way of using it, what definition, which one gives you more utility. So in this case, we only care if it's a camera based on whether or not we can take pictures with it, right? That's the only time we care whether or not it's a camera.
Well, would you say that like both groups would you say that like the group that's talking about utility is effectively just like lying to themselves about their argument or their definition, and they're really using the definition of the other group. Is that what you would say? Because they're calling this thing a camera, even though if they found out that it was cake, they would then change. But like they're calling it a camera based on visuals. Would you say that they're like not even using their own definition in this case?
If they're calling it a camera based on the way it looks, is what you're asking.
Despite the fact that they believe a camera is something that can take pictures, they're calling this thing that is actually made of cake, they're calling it a camera.
Yeah. I would say that it would lose all value at that point. That if you're going to do it like that, then you've lost all value of the word camera.
Lost all value? What do you mean by that?
So if it's not based on the utility, it's not based on the way that you use this word and what it is that it communicates to other people, then you've lost all value in that word.
I mean, I would argue that there's still, the utility is still there. They're saying that like, they're trying to communicate a concept of something capable of producing pictures. I would just say they're incorrect in this case, where they think it's one thing, but it's actually the other thing.
Well,
in the same way that like,
I'm sorry, I thought you were saying if they chose to stick with that definition, even if they knew it was a cake, they chose to stick with that definition based on the way that it looks.
Yeah, I mean, like, but the analogy would be like conservatives don't, or, you know, people who don't believe that trans women are women don't stick with the definition of woman after finding out. So they might see someone who looks like a woman, but it's an, you know.
But don't you think that that's more so in protest than it is actual utility in the word? Because they'll use she, her as long as they don't know. But like when it comes to the utility of the word and the way that they understand it, obviously they're using it the way that they understand it. And then once they find out, oh, this isn't what I'm supposed to do, I now need to protest this and use the other pronouns that I'm supposed to use.
I just think they disagree about the definition of something. So, I mean, I don't know if I'd call like protest. Maybe it's like a form of protest, just because of like the current political environment. But like, I would just say they're switching to like, you know, language that they believe is more accurate.
But I feel like it proves that it's not accurate in that case. Because if they think it's this, and now they find out some irrelevant information that doesn't actually change anything for them, they're going to change the way that they address this person anyways. And if they say, hey, and if they say to somebody else, hey, that guy over there, nobody's going to look at that person. They're going to be like, who are you talking about? It loses all utility at that point.
The other analogy would be like looking at the forest and seeing something that is like a painted mock-up of a tree, but is not in fact a biological living organism capable of engaging in photosynthesis. And, you know, it's just believing that it's a tree does not mean that like a tree is anything that looks like a tree. Believing that it's a tree just means that you're incorrect. Your perception is not aligning with reality. And it doesn't like erase the fact that like, the fact that like trees exist. And you're right that like you lose utility if you were to like point to the object that is painted to look like a tree. And if you were to point to it and be like, look out in that field for the thing that is a construction facsimile of a tree, people will be like, what the fuck are you saying? Like, it wouldn't be like effective to like call it that necessarily. Mm-hmm. But I think maybe like the disagreement here is like, well, sometimes we've got to like sacrifice effectiveness in like language concision for truth. And that's like the conservative argument where they'd be like, yes, it's confusing if I point to someone who obviously looks like a woman and say that they're male or a man. That's like confusing and not convenient to do. But they would say that's like more accurate to the truth.
Yeah. I feel like they misunderstand. I mean, I've had this conversation with them a million times, and especially as like somebody who had that position for a long time. Once I got into linguistics and started like learning all of the different ways that we utilize language and the way that we come up with the meaning and the definitions and the understandings of these things, I started to like once I heard the real argument for trans people, not the fake ones that like the conservatives say all the time, like, you know, Steven Crowder and Ben Shapiro and the ones that they literally make up. But like the real arguments for these things, I immediately understood and was like, oh crap, I've been wrong this entire time. I had absolutely no clue what I was talking about. But other people that I don't think actually understand the differences in how we use language and even how they're using it, I feel like they just misunderstand. I feel like they don't actually understand, or they understand and they're choosing not to take on that understanding based on the need to protest.
Yeah, maybe. I would say that I'm in general like somewhat agnostic about this issue.
So if
Like
people started calling you a man, you'd be perfectly okay with it.
it depends. I think it's okay as long as I'm still allowed to transition and present female and wear the kind of clothing that I want and have access to like the kind of healthcare I want. So what's important to me is like access to those things more than like the specific definitional word we use. And so that would be like my big battleground. Whether or not like someone considers me a man or a woman necessarily is like less important to me than those other things.
Isn't that kind of the point though? What's the point in transitioning if
Yeah.
you're not viewed as a woman?
Yeah. I mean, kind of. The other point is that like a lot of people who like believe that I'm a man are just like not willing to allow me those other things. And so, you know, insofar as like someone's going to make the definition of woman, like someone who's allowed to present this way and wear this kind of clothing and this kind of makeup or look this certain way, you know, then I'm going to have like quite a big problem with defining womanhood in a way to exclude me.
Yeah, do you think it's more so going to be based on different types of dysphoria then?
What do
Because
you
I
mean?
don't understand if when you say, I guess I don't know if I actually like got a satisfactory answer on it. I don't know that. I don't mean to push you if you don't want to talk about it.
Sure. Push away.
What is the point in transitioning if you are not viewed as a woman? Like what what's the point in it then?
I want to be able to wear certain types of clothing and have my body look a certain way. And I want to present myself in a certain way. That, you know, that's the goal. And whether or not people like choose to call that woman or not, as long as I have like the freedom to do these sorts of things, it doesn't really matter to me. As long as people like treat me with dignity and respect as like a human being and allow me to like make these sort of choices, I'm not super concerned about the specific word they use. I will say, like, this is like, we're in hypothetical, like, kind of fantasy land here. Because, like, if someone doesn't believe that I'm a woman, right, chances are they also are not going to treat me with respect, dignity, or believe that I have, like, the right to do these sorts of things with my body, right? So there's, like, a massive overlap between these groups. But like in the fantasy land where someone is like totally fine with me, like totally chill with me, you know, even probably like uses pronouns that I want so they're not like outing me right in public, because that would be dangerous, and not treating me with respect. They're like using all of these pronouns. They like think it's totally fine that I'm presenting this way, but like internally they just believe that I'm male or like a man. Like that doesn't make a difference to me.
See, I like I have trouble sometimes coming to a conclusion on how we can completely separate the concepts of male and man. And I don't think we can. I don't think it's possible to completely separate those two things because I think one is based on the other. I think like a concept of a man is based on expectations of a male. And so I don't think we can ever separate those things completely. But I think it sounds like what you're saying is they can view you as a male but treat you as a man, and that
Treat me as a man or treat me as a
or
woman.
sorry I'm getting I'm using it as a Yeah, we can go with woman. I'm sorry, I was using it as a hypothetical, but yeah, using it as they can see you as a man and treat you as a woman. Yeah.
Yeah. In this like a sort of hypothetical fantasy land that we've constructed, I would be okay with that. And the only reason like I feel the need to caveat so much is because I think that that's like extremely hard for people to do. Like you said, it'd be extremely hard for people to like separate the concept of like male and manhood or woman and or female and womanhood, right? And so I think that like you're right in this, where if someone sees me as male, they're probably not going to treat me as a woman. They're probably not going to be like super nice to me. They're probably going to like not respect me and so on because of my choices. And so like the realistic, this kind of like environment is not very realistic.
Well, I mean,
and in most cases, yeah.
the more dissident fascistic groups that I engage with on the right do this on a consistent basis, where like they engage with trans people and they flip flop on which pronouns they're using. And it seems obvious. They're using she, her pronouns naturally, but then they remember, oh crap, I wasn't supposed to say that. And they go back to he, him pronouns because that's what they're supposed to do. That's part of the protest, or that's what they have to do to be part of the group. And so it seems like they have this battle in their heads on a consistent basis where they naturally use these words the same as the rest of us. They use it based on the concept and the way that they understand, or the way, yeah, with the same understanding of what these things are, and like how we assign these sorts of pronouns to people. But they have like this inner battle with themselves where they keep switching back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, because one is a lot more natural for them to say, but the other one is the one that they're supposed to say.
Yeah.
Do you not run into this?
I mean, I think you're right. Like you're talking about this like Ben Shapiro, like referring to someone as like she, her, and then like gets corrected by Joe Rogan or like reminded that they're trans and then like switches to he, him. So yeah, this stuff definitely like does happen. And it's because they've got this like, they have a very difficult time disconnecting the concepts of like what looks like a woman and the definition of like what they believe a woman actually is. And so, if you see someone who looks like a woman, the natural impulse is to refer to them as she, her. And that makes it very difficult for some conservatives to refer to some trans women as he, him, because every time they look at them, their brain is saying that's a woman, she, her.
Yep. I really appreciate this conversation. Actually, I have trouble with people actually having this conversation where the whole time I'm still explaining the first part just over and over and over and over. But I appreciate that you're actually able to engage with this and like hear what it is that I'm saying and give me a good response. It's rare, unfortunately.
Yeah, and hopefully I can give like you and your chat something to think about with, maybe steel manning these conservative arguments, these conservative definitions of
My chat
man and woman.
seems to be farther right than they are left. So
interesting. So hopefully they appreciate it.
Yeah. I'm gonna invite Quibbles in real quick.
Okay, let's do it. Blood sports. We're gonna destroy Quibbles in the battleground of ideas.
All right, here we go. I gotta run to the restroom real quick. So, Quibbles.
Oh, I don't have blood sports necessarily.
It doesn't have to be blood
Quibbles,
sports.
are you prepared to defend your ideas to the death right now?
Oh, for sure, 100%. Are we doing Georgism? I was just curious what your definition. I was listening to that conversation. So what's like the the taking pictures of being a woman in the mind of a conservative?
Oh, taking pictures, in the analogy, the equivalent would be like giving birth. And so
Okay.
a conservative would say that, like, you know, if we take this analogy further, the analogy would be that like a camera that for whatever reason like has its shutter roll taken out is still a camera, even though it's not able to at the moment produce pictures. And so like a conservative would say that like, you know, to refine the definition, they'd be like, a woman is someone capable of producing children or would be capable of producing children if not for like some small deviation from the mean. And so the camera analogy would be like, a camera is something that is capable of taking pictures or would be capable of taking pictures if not for like some small deviation from the mean, i.e. like, you know, a piece missing or, you know, something like that.
But that to me
Interesting.
is why like there's an issue, is that the even like biologists had pointed out this problem for a while, to where like when we were talking about a woman, we weren't actually talking about like chromosomes or like what it is that they consider woman. So we separate like woman and female. And most major medical associations have like separated sex and gender by the 80s because of this problem that they had, where they understood that these were different things that they were talking about, because nobody's checking their gametes, nobody's checking their chromosomes, nobody's checking their private parts. And so like they started to separate what it was that they were talking about from what it was that the rest of us are talking about. And so I feel like it's necessary to have those different words based on what it is that we're talking about in that moment.
I do think that Tufts, is it Toft or is it Tuft? I don't know how to say your name.
You can say Taff or you can say April, whatever is
Taft?
easier.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I think that your point there about it being about pregnancy is, I think, probably a better version of the conservative viewpoint than to make it about like gametes or whatever, just because like that's something, number one, that's something that was understood for thousands of years. And number two, it's also like a lot more to do with sort of the societal and sort of social framing than gametes that people aren't hyper cognizant of all of the time. But like if you're thinking about like why society has been built in the way that it has, I'd argue that like a lot of it does come down, like the gender roles have a lot to do with pregnancy, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, the reason I try to speak broadly is because different conservatives will make the argument slightly differently.
Mm-hmm.
Where I think, like, most often you'll hear a definition of womanhood where it's like there's a series of essential, like, components, none of which are, like, wholly necessary or sufficient. So, like, you might say, like, a woman is someone with, like, a vagina capable of having periods, giving birth, and has XX chromosomes. And they'll say that like, in order to be a woman, you need to have like most of these, where like, yeah, you could be a woman who like isn't able to give birth for some reason, but if you still have like XX chromosomes and a vagina, you still count. And this argument gets like put in different ways. So I'm just trying to like speak somewhat broadly, but
yeah,
to the camera analogy, giving birth would be the equivalent of taking pictures.
Interesting. Because yeah, like the camera component, like I don't know enough about a camera to be able to like say the equivalent of the period or the equivalent of having a vagina or whatever it might be. But like there's a lot of inputs that are necessary in order to get to that like endpoint. But the actual like thing that makes it a camera is the ability to take pictures, and the equivalent thing that makes a woman, according to this line of logic, would be the ability to have kids.
I did see a debate with Destiny and Sargon of Akkad a while back, and the definition that Sargon, Carl Benjamin, gives for woman is basically this, where he says like the ability to give birth is what makes someone a woman. And Destiny like basically sunlocks him by being like, well, not all women can have children. And this is like a common back and forth argumentation. So like if you want to refine the definition a little bit in order to like steelman the conservative side, you would say that like, well, it's someone who would like be able to give birth or would be able to give birth if not for like some small deviation.
For some, right. But then couldn't you say that like the deviation of someone who's trans is just that they had some, mistake of birth in the same way that someone might have a mistake of birth of not being able to be pregnant for any number of other reasons?
It probably depends on the trans person. Like you can have like trans people who are intersex and therefore like much closer to a, quote unquote, like biological woman. Or you can have like a trans person who is XY chromosomes, went through male puberty, like is wholly biologically identical with like the most masculine of men and is still like a trans woman who's like beginning transition. And so like these people would be like different in the kind of camera/woman like spectrum. So, would one of these people maybe be considered like a woman if not for some deviation, and the other person would not? I think that might be true depending on the trans person. But typically, I think that the kind of line in the sand that conservatives are going to draw as far as what counts as, an acceptably small deviation from the norm is not going to be so far on that spectrum that it includes very many trans people at all. It's probably going to exclude most of them.
But they wouldn't consider it to be on a spectrum at all. They would consider all of these things to be objective, and that's my problem. I've had this debate with BPF and Rob Noor, and this is what BPF does is every time you disprove his current position, he says, oh, well, if that's the case, then we move to this definition. It's like, okay, well, what about these problems? And you show the inconsistency there. And he says, well, then we would move to this definition. And it's like, we don't do that with anything else, bro. There's nothing in the world where we keep changing the definition every time it doesn't, like every time we're inconsistent on it. We say, oh, well, it's okay because we have this third, fourth, fifth definition that we can move to each time. They don't.
I think it's a kind of.
Yeah,
sorry, no, go ahead. Well, I think it's a kind of hands and wrists thing where like we can recognize that objectively there's such a thing as hands and there's such a thing as wrist. But like drawing the exact line in the sand where like the hand ends and the wrist begins, I think is somewhat difficult. And so I think you're like correctly. I mean, maybe. I think that you can make like an argument for what is what, but like it's going to vary from culture to culture and from person to person.
I agree with what you're saying. My point is they're not going to agree with that. They're going to say these are objective lines in the sand that exist. But when it comes to their definition, it'll never actually be that.
Well, I mean, I think that they would say that there's like I think we would probably both agree that there's like objectively the kind of thing that is a hand and a wrist. Like defining that exact difference is a little bit difficult. And I think you're pointing out that like when you talk to conservatives, they have like a lot of difficulty defining the distinction here. But I don't think that really gets to the heart of the argument, because even if they have like trouble defining the difference, they're still going to tell you that like at the end of the day, there is a difference. And it's just, maybe difficult to capture with words, but
I agree they think that there's a difference, but I don't think that in the way that they use the words, I think there's like I think that they will end up always using these words the way that the rest of us use them.
I think you could define it as having like an objective basis, even if the sort of the lines aren't objective, if that makes sense. So like you can say that like it's coming from a vantage point of this pregnancy thing, or it's coming from this vantage point of the ability to take pictures, but there's some degree of like nuance on the edges, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. I think that's like the most honest conservative position you can get. I have no doubt that there are like conservatives who are like complete assholes who like, refuse to acknowledge that there might be any sort of nuance. But I think like the Steelman version of the argument is to recognize that there's nuance and that, the line is not exactly clear between head and neck, but there are distinctions between heads and necks.
Yeah, it's coherent. I'm not sure if I agree with it, but it does seem broadly coherent.
I'm glad you think so. That's
Does that okay? If I were to grant this framework of what womanhood is, how would you be defining manhood, and would there be space for other definitions of other things that are not male or female?
I'm not exactly sure, actually, how manhood would be defined. That would be maybe a question for maybe more conservative philosophers who thought about that more. To the other question, what do you mean by things that are not necessarily male?
Well, it strikes me that, like, if you're going to define this grouping of people, loosely we'll call it a gender, I guess, of like womanhood on the basis of the ability to be pregnant. If you're going to define it in that sense, like there's one version of that, which is to define like all people as either they can or can't get pregnant. There's another way to define it, which is like they can get pregnant, they can impregnate, or they can't do either of those things. And then there's another way of defining it. Like, you see what I'm saying? Like there's multiple ways of defining the non-woman group, if that makes sense.
I see. Yeah, and again, taking this like cogent sort of steelman position, where there is a recognition of this nuance. I think that with that recognition, you'd probably say that there's like these two broad categories, and one of them is like ability to get pregnant, if not for like some deviation, and then ability to impregnate, if not for some deviation. And like there's going to be people who are like unable to impregnate or be impregnated. And your question is like, how would a conservative, categorize this type of person, right?
Yeah, essentially.
Yeah, I think that they would fall back on just like closeness to people like capable of being impregnated or impregnating people. So like they would look at someone capable of becoming impregnated, and they would look at like all the traits of this hypothetical person, and they would say, okay, they line up in these traits and they don't line up in these other traits. And they would do the same thing for someone capable of impregnating people. And then they would make a decision based on, whether or not they tilt more one way or another way. Though, I think you could also imagine like a version of this argument that says that there's some group of like truly, middle road intersex people that are neither, man nor woman. And that's, intersex is like relatively common, but like that true kind of like pure hermaphrodite intersex is like extraordinarily rare. And they might, concede that hypothetically you could have someone that's like purely in the middle, or like relatively close to the middle, that like it's only tilting one way by one factor, and therefore you can't really call them a man or a woman. That also seems plausible to me.
Interesting. Okay, and so how would you define the utility of defining it in this way? Oh, shoot. Hello? Can you hear me now? That's not good.
I'm so sorry. I can hear you now.
Okay, sweet. Yeah, so like, how would you define the utility of this rather than defining it in a sense that is broadly more inclusive of the way that people want to identify, if that makes sense?
The utility of this versus inclusiveness. I will say that when I say like a woman or a man in my life, I am not using these conservative definitions of like, a strict sense of like ability or proximity to people capable of impregnating or being impregnated. So that's not how I'm using the words in my day-to-day life. Part of that is because I don't really buy into this argument myself. But the other reason is just because it would be like confusing for people. And for most of the environments that I exist in, this definition of man or woman would seem, pretty alien to people. I think that if you are in a conservative environment that is motivated to preserve some sense of like sex and gender being associated with sex, I think the utility is in like preserving that sort of connection there. So someone like Ben Shapiro is going to make the argument that like using this definition of man or woman is a necessary step to like preserving gender roles. And he or Matt Walsh would say that once you start using a definition of woman that can include people capable of impregnating, and once you start using a definition of man that includes people capable of being impregnated, you are taking the first steps to like eroding these cultural categories that have spiritual and, you know, cultural use to us. That's, I think, the utility that they would pitch to you.
Yeah. Yeah, I recognize that this is not necessarily. I'm not sure how much you actually ascribe to this, because you were saying that like, you don't use this in your day-to-day life, but that's sort of somewhat different than if you actually ascribe to it. But I guess the immediate thought that I have in response to that would be that like there's no sense in which allowing someone who is not able to get pregnant because they are trans to be in the broad categorization. I can't see how that's like distinct in terms of the effects on gender roles than someone who can't get pregnant because they're too old or can't get pregnant because of any number of other reasons that might stop them, if that makes sense.
I'm surprised you say this, because I feel like this is maybe like one of the more easy points to view, right? Because like someone who is not able to get pregnant because of age or, you know, some other small factor is a lot closer to like the definition of woman as we've discussed it, the conservative definition, than someone who's not able to get pregnant because they are biologically male and otherwise, you know, fall on the male distribution of these sorts of things. So, you know, it's like if you were to say like a tree is this list of attributes, but then we start including like broccoli in the tree category, we're not expanding the definition of tree so much as if we started including like snakes in the definition of tree. And so I think that's like sort of how the conservatives will view it, how someone like Matt Walsh will view it. He'll be like, yeah, if you expand, you know, the definition of woman to include, you know, people who are not able to get pregnant of old age, we're like maybe not expanding the definition at all if you're taking like the nuanced understanding of this definition, or we're expanding it like relatively little compared to expanding it to include trans people.
Yeah, I guess the way I would frame it is like what I'm thinking about in terms of the social roles of women versus non-women is like, okay, here's one version of a social role of women that you could imagine: breastfeeding, right? It's not literally giving birth, it's not literally being pregnant, but it is something that is resultant, that is related to that. Another thing that you could imagine is like there is a broad sense in which, because of the historic relationship that women had with small children, again, resultant from breastfeeding, resultant from them having given birth, there is a sense in which like women are considered more sort of representative of the home, whereas men are considered more representative outside of the home. Not necessarily something that we should, you know, ascribe sort of as being a necessity necessarily, but it is something certainly that has been a dominant force across most societies across time. If we're thinking about the first one, I don't see how, you know, the old woman is different than the trans woman. And if we're thinking about the second one, I also don't see how the old woman is different than the trans woman, if that makes sense.
Can you repeat these definitions real quick?
So one like it's downstream from the cameras taking pictures. It's downstream from like the woman has the ability to become pregnant. But one version of that is like women have the ability to breastfeed, right? And that's something that is directly resultant from the ability to give birth, or at least hyper related to it. And that is something that neither an old woman nor a trans woman has the capacity to do, right? But then the second example would be like the ability to be very much in relation to small children, very much in relation to you know, the home and the work that happens in the home, and that's something that I'd argue is something that can be and often is something that is taken on as a social role, both by older women as well as by trans women.
I mean, I would say that like an older woman, I'm not exactly sure that like older women can't breastfeed, because I think you can like induce lactation, but like we'll just say like hypothetically that like older women, they can't breastfeed, definitely not. I would say that that's true. And also like trees can't breastfeed, and like, you know, my computer can't breastfeed, right? That doesn't mean that like because we consider a older woman a woman, we also have to consider like trees or my computer also a woman, because like they're both not, you know, needing this qualification of womanhood, which is like this downstream effect from being able to give birth. And I think that would be like sort of the argument here with trans women and this older woman, where it's like, it's true that they're both not meeting this sort of like cultural association with womanhood or with pregnancy, but that's not like sufficient for defining them as both a woman.
Yeah, that seems reasonable. Interesting.
It like I'm trying to like brain blast here, because I remember there's this like philosophical argument that's like very like non-intuitive but does make sense if you like work it out. And oh god, I feel like I'm gonna butcher it, but it's something like all crows are black, and therefore if you see something that is like non-black and not a crow, then this like in some small way proves that all crows are black. And it's something that's like incredibly unintuitive, and everyone's like, that's bullshit, right? Like, how is seeing like a red mitten proof that like all crows are black? But if you like work it out logically, you know, it's just like, because there are so many non-crow objects, like the weight of evidence is like incredibly small. It's like basically non-existent, but it is there. I think that like that's kind of maybe like a point in your favor. But you might have to talk to someone who's more adept with philosophy to get the full scoop on that.
I know the argument that you're talking about. I thought it was the other way around, though. I thought it was if it's not black, or it's all crows are black, and so if it's not black, then it's not a crow.
That's another way to like put, I think, a different thing. And that's like sort of the
Gotcha.
I don't know. There's like another logical argument where you can make where it's like
thing,
penguins are like white and black, and you know, newspapers are white and black, therefore they're penguins. So there's lots of like, I don't know, weird sort of like color definitions in philosophy. But the crows and the black thing, I think, is distinct from that.
Gotcha.